Hello, my name is Arpi. In this video series, my colleague Toghrul Abbasov and I discuss films that either directly or indirectly touch upon the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. As we mentioned in our previous episode, in this last episode we will discuss third-party documentary films. We will see how these films approach the conflict. Most of these films are not quite well known by a larger public, and we hope that after this episode you will find out about new films and will take time to watch them. And for that, today we have invited guests, people who have worked on these documentaries with the authors from Armenia and Azerbaijan. We will talk to Nino Oրջonikidze from Chaikhana and Dr. Lorentz Broers from Conciliation Resources.
Hello, I am Toghrul. Today, in our fifth episode, our guest is Nino Oրջonikidze. She's a documentary filmmaker, a lecturer at JIPA, and the commissioning editor at Chaikhana digital platform. Welcome, Nino, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Hello, Toghrul, and thanks for your interest.
First, I would like you briefly talk about Chaikhana and your role in it, how it was created, when did documentaries start being part of Chaikhana?
All right, thanks. So Chaikhana was created 8 years ago, and it was created by Caroline Sutcliffe, who used to work previously in Azerbaijan and also in Georgia. So with her colleagues, documentary filmmaker, then student of JIPA where I was teaching, Lala Alieva. So in collaboration, they created with also colleagues from Armenia, this platform. Their idea was really to create a platform for South Caucasus beginner journalists, let's put it so. And so they started mentoring, training, and creating content from all three countries. And this is when they invited me in the beginning as a mentor for video storytellers. And so basically I joined after 2-3 months when it was established. They had media managers from Georgia, from Armenia, from Azerbaijan, and basically the main focus was ordinary people's lives, conflict-affected territories, how women are coping on conflict-affected territories with everyday life, minority issues, basically human rights issues. So, and this is kind of our focus after 8 years. Chaikhana management is changing, but we still we are developing. We have now different kind of slots and trends, not only documentary films, but also photo projects, articles, but it all focused on human stories from all three countries. As for myself, since I joined, I was curating video content, and later our kind of general video content transformed more in a documentary, short documentary film production, because we found it very relevant and very interesting, because lots of contributors were interested to have a space and platform to experiment with the form. And there is not a big opportunity for our countries to find funds to tell kind of stories of ordinary people and experiment with the form. So Chaikhana tried to create that space for contributors. We don't have journalists in the staff. We only have management and kind of editors, and then we commission content, and we have lots of huge network of contributors from all three countries. This is how we work.
Thank you. So since today our main topic is documentaries about conflicts, particularly the Karabakh conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So what do you think is the role of documentary films in helping us to understand the conflict or influencing our perspectives on it?
I think it's really important to hear first-hand information from ordinary people who really experience this conflict, who live there. So, and what is very important for me and Chaikhana very often is doing films, is commissioning films from personal perspective. Very often our authors create so-called first-person documentaries where we allow to share visually their own experience, how they perceive conflict. I think it's really important to give a voice to those who might be beyond kind of mainstream media. This is why it's important. For instance, there is an author from Armenia. She tells her story about her friendship with Azerbaijani girl. They are both artists and they met each other having a fellowship somewhere in Poland. And we kind of really observe and go with them through ups and downs and how they feel about this conflict. And what is important, this documentary film form gives us possibility to really sincerely and honestly to hear and to observe how they feel about that. This is why it's important.
These short feature documentary films don't get many views. I mean, in comparison with the local fiction films. So what can be done to increase viewership? For instance, in Chaikhana, most of the films are inaccessible to either the audience in Armenia or Azerbaijan because the films have no Armenian and Azerbaijani subtitles. Do you think this is one of the issues?
How Chaikhana works, our main language of communication is English. And it's not Russian. And although we have some of the materials in 5 languages, which is Georgian, Armenian, Azerbaijani, Russian, and English, but not all the materials are translated in all 5 languages due to lack of the resources. We just don't have that much resources. Otherwise, we would love to translate it in all 5 languages because our audience speak those 5 languages. I would say that even if we have, for instance, 1,000, 2,000, or 3,000 people in our countries watching film which goes against the mainstream propaganda, I think still it is very important and depicts in the moment of war, documents very important stories. I still think it's very important because it's also very interesting archive that Chaikhana creates about how ordinary people feel in these times.
And I think another challenge for you as since you the third party to the conflict, try to keep a certain balance in your films. For instance, you might decide to avoid touching on or showing a scene that could be highly sensitive to one of the parties to the conflict. How do you think this affects the quality of the films? How do you get around this?
As for balance, how we balance it in a way we don't claim in one film we provide both sides. I mean, we don't ask author to provide kind of objective reality. When we talk about creative documentary filmmaking, we don't pretend it's an objective reality which kind of includes both sides. How we balance, we give platform for both sides. For instance, when we have a story from the home front, from Azerbaijan, we provide the platform for another side as well. And this is how we balance. But I don't think that in that sense it affects quality, because for us, quality, as I understand it, it's really being honest, really being sincere, try to tell your story, to transform kind of your story in an interesting, artistic and creative form. This is for me what is quality. Chaikhana short creative documentaries is not that much about analysis. It's not that much kind of journalistic product, right? If you understand what I mean. So for us, what matters and what is quality for me, it's how sincere is the author and how the author manages to give us insight into the story from her or his own perspective. And then we have kind of films from, for instance, post-war Azerbaijan and how IDPs are experiencing situation in post-war Azerbaijan. And then we have the kind of story with the same angle from Armenia. And this is what our balance is about.
So in this case, do you have faced any negativity or any judgment from Armenian or Azerbaijani audience while talking conflict-related issues? I mean, you give that for both sides. So, and if yes, and how you deal with it?
Thank you for this question. Yes, sometimes, especially during the online screenings, right? During, like, we have sometimes hate speech from both sides, but I would say rarely. As I experienced, not that much, and because the stories we cover and the human angle, it often creates this empathy, as far as I understand. There are isolated cases when opposite sides sometimes write very negative comments, but I would not say it happens very often. Because it's also maybe the audience, as you mentioned, is not very large, and people who are interested in these stories are already quite kind of open-minded people, and they are already part of this discourse. But we are very careful. We cover stories where we see really human angles. The method very often we work in documentaries is really observational, and really we observe first-hand narratives, which is quite difficult not to empathize with, even from the other side.
Lastly, I would like to ask about cooperation. Some films have been made through mutual cooperation between both sides, and you mentioned that, such as Bonded by Memories, for example. How do you think films made through mutual cooperation change the approach of the filmmakers themselves?
It does, and what we observe as a Chaikhana team, I think it's a very interesting process. How, and some films actually are about this exploration and this finding new truths, so-called, which is quite interesting. And it's very interesting for me to observe this cooperation. And I have not only Bounded by Memories. It's not the only case where authors from all three countries, or all, like Armenia and Azerbaijan, cooperated. It gives so much hope because to see the open-minded people who go against what is accepted in their countries, against the kind of mainstream agenda. Even during war times, not all of them, but most of the contributors are quite open-minded in this relationship. I think that's the most interesting part of working in Chaikhana, to have this safe space where people from different perspectives can be in this creative dialogue, and filmmaking is a creative dialogue.
Thank you very much, Nino, for your thoughts and for sharing your experience with us.
Thanks a lot, Toghrul. Thanks for your interest and for your contribution as well.
Now I give floor to Arpi.
My guest today is Dr. Lorenс Broers, the Caucasus Program Director at London-based peacebuilding organization Conciliation Resources, and an Associate Fellow of Chatham House Russia and Eurasia Program. Hello, Mr. Broers. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Talking about the work that Conciliation Resources have been doing in Caucasus, one of the first things that comes to mind is the three-part documentary called Parts of a Circle, the summary of which was published in 2020, before the Nagorno-Karabakh war, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell a little bit about this film? How did the idea come to start this project, and what kind of risks and challenges you faced during all the years of working on this film?
Sure. Well, the Parts of a Circle story is a very long story, because it actually began in 2011, if I remember correctly, when one of our local partners suggested this idea to try to juxtapose Armenian and Azerbaijani perspectives on the same events in a way that would highlight the different understandings, and that would allow the viewer to triangulate their own view relative to these two narratives of these events. So it was, in a way, it was about recognizing that an impartial view of these very traumatic events is perhaps still really elusive and impossible, but by kind of balancing or juxtaposing two differing accounts, one could arrive at, one could invite a viewer to make up their own minds, and to also become aware of their own partiality and their own assumptions and the way that they had received and understood these stories. So a key sort of technical problem was how to do that within the film format. How would you have two narratives reflected in the same film? And the way that we did that was to have alternating segments. So in the first two films of the trilogy, you have these alternating segments. The first film begins with an Armenian segment for 15 minutes, then an Azerbaijani segment, and so on. And these segments often go over the same events, but present them from the perspective of one side, or the media professionals, the journalists who were making the film, sort of from their perspective. So that is how you have this kind of juxtaposed sense of perspectives. In the third film, which addresses the peace process, there was a collective decision that we didn't need to have this alternating perspective, and so it's just a single narrative. So that was a kind of a technical issue in the filmmaking. We obviously had a lot of issues in the process of making the films in terms of agreeing how certain events would be depicted and talked about. So, you know, each team wrote their own segments, produced their own segments, but everything in the film was approved by both teams. So it is a collective statement. So we had enormous issues discussing how to cover, you know, really difficult events, from the pogroms in Sumgait to the massacre in Khojaly, just as some, you know, the most stark examples. But we did find a way, and in the end, the main problem of this project was the surrounding environment in which it was being implemented. So we began filming in around 2012, 2013. And of course, from 2014, we started to see these regular escalations along the line of contact. The films were then completed in 2016, which we saw the 4-day war, plus an ongoing crackdown on civil society in Azerbaijan. That made it very difficult to think about outreach for these films. So the irony of the project was that, we produced these films, which were meant to be, very much a public product, but we weren't really able to make them public because of concerns for our partners in Azerbaijan. Some of our interviewees were people who had been arrested and imprisoned on alleged charges of espionage through their contacts with Armenians. So it was a very, very sensitive context. But now I'm pleased to say you can find the whole trilogy in addition to the summary film that you mentioned online.
There is also this short 10-minute video, which consists mostly of interviews with Armenian and Azerbaijani journalists talking about how they worked and collaborated together on this documentary. And from this video, you can see how hard it was for them, actually. Was this also the reason that in the beginning only the summary of the film published, not the whole series? Because as I remember, the 3 parts were published later, right?
Yes, so I think the idea to do the summary film in a way was a response to the blockage on publishing the 3 films of the trilogy. I think we felt that if it was too challenging in that particular environment for partners to kind of lead and own these films and be the public face of them, then that is something that Conciliation Resources as an organization could do. So we drafted the script for the summary film, and it is more Conciliation Resources sort of interpretation of the 3 films. There's no new material in the summary film. It's all based on the trilogy. But yes, I think even in that short film about the film, you can feel some of the tensions that were there. There's an awful lot of discussions about balance. What is false equivalence? What is false balance? What is both-sidism? We weren't using the language of both-sidism in those days. Both-sidism really came in, I think, as a concept in this context with the Second Karabakh War. But in the end, we did manage to resolve those issues. And one other point that I'd make is that the outside environment was really the determining factor for the relations within the group. When we were working on the first film, you would expect that the most difficult discussions would be about the very traumatic events that happened in the lead up to the conflict and the war itself. Those were actually not the worst discussions that we had. The worst discussions were actually around the third film, when the environment was already highly charged, politicized, polarized. So I think there's a sort of, a point there about how difficult it is to promote reconciliation, peace building, dialogue, when, the entire atmosphere is so polarized and charged, that actually it can be more challenging than actually going into the weeds of the issues that actually divide Armenians and Azerbaijanis.
Thank you. And long before this project, the Parts of a Circle film, there was another project by Conciliation Resources called Dialogue Through Films, which was a series of documentaries made by Armenian and Azerbaijani colleagues again, and not only from Armenia and Azerbaijan, but also people from Nagorno-Karabakh participated. Can you tell us a little bit about this project, how it started, and what were the challenges?
Yes. So yes, Dialogue Through Film is actually a project that began before I joined Conciliation Resources. And the essential idea behind the film behind the project, was to provide opportunities for young people to make a film about some aspects of living with conflict. So we paired up young people with a professional director. They would, make the film together. So that was, on the one hand, it was a sort of a media training and professionalization project. The young people would then meet in Tbilisi and show their films to one another and discuss. So it was also a dialogue meeting, a dialogue project. And then the films would become a public output. So it worked on these three levels. And in fact, it was for young people from Nagorno-Karabakh. So it was Karabakh Armenians together with young people from Azerbaijan, including, of course, some internally displaced participants. So it was an unusual project in the sense that it was articulated at this level of Azerbaijan with Karabakh Armenians. So in all, I think more than 30 films were made over the course of this project. Some of them were joint films, explicitly joint films, were made together. And then there was an outreach program of hundreds of screenings across the context. And on that basis, we then made a handbook, which was published a few years ago, that has interviews with the filmmakers. Again, it's with DVDs inside, and a lot of additional materials, kind of unpacking the layers of questions and themes that were covered in these films. So these films can also be found on the Conciliation Resources website, also I think on YouTube and Vimeo.
As these films were made a long time ago, many people don't know about them, especially the younger generation, and they don't know that these films exist online. Maybe you can recommend some of them, and which are your favorite films of this series?
Well, I do really like the joint films that were made in this project. So the one that I remember, I think most clearly, is My Enemy, My Friend, which was the story of two human rights practitioners, Albert Voskanyan in Nagorno-Karabakh and Abbas Hassanov, who, both of them are good friends of mine. Abbas Hassanov passed away, just over a year ago, which was a great loss, I think, to Azerbaijani civil society, to dialogue, and to the whole project of building an Armenian-Azerbaijani peace. And so I think, that film is particularly poignant because it records their history as practitioners working on cases of missing persons and the repatriation of prisoners of war. It's a very, very moving film. Other films that I really appreciated, At the Eighth Kilometer, I think is a really interesting, again, a joint film that looks at kind of broken kinship relations. So I remember one part of the film is about an Armenian, a so-called crypto-Armenian still living in Azerbaijan, who has kind of lost contact with her Armenian family members. And there's a similar story from Nagorno-Karabakh, a woman who's lost contact with her sister, who now lived in Azerbaijan. Very moving stories, so easily forgotten that there were these kinship relations, even though intermarriage, I think, was not anywhere near as common as perhaps we've been led to believe in some of the discussions. The level of intermarriage was actually lower between Armenians and Azerbaijanis than any other Union Republic level nationalities in the Soviet Union, but still, obviously, there were kinship relations. And another film that I think always hits the spot is the film called All Films About Love, which is, again, about a mixed marriage, where the husband is Armenian and is a film shower, runs a cinema, and his Azerbaijani wife and they lost two of their children, one of them through the Karabakh War, and it's a very poignant story. And the husband in the story actually passed away a few years ago. So once again, you know, I think one of the values of these films is that they are recording stories of people who in many cases are no longer with us. This is also the case with Parts of a Circle. There are interviews there with people like Igor Muradyan, who is no longer with us, who played a key role in the early days of the conflict. So I think there's a sense of, you know, we've been making this transition over the past over recent decades from the Karabakh conflict as a lived experience that was, you know, directly experienced by people, to a learned experience, to a conflict that people learn about in school, inevitably through particular political and ideological prisms. You know, what these films offer, I think, is a kind of anthology of real lived experience that in many ways stands counter to the conflict narratives and the more ideological representations of the conflict. And I think in that sense, their value will only grow over time.
And while Parts of a Circle is more about history of the conflict and peace process, the Dialogue Through Films program was more about human stories. But now, after the second Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, we have new stories in both aspects. Do you think it is possible to have new joint projects, both about human stories and then also the history that is happening now after second Nagorno-Karabakh war?
Well, my personal sense is that it's still very soon after those events. Normally, you know, after a war or an event of that level of trauma, it takes a few years, I think, for there to be sufficient space and distance for people to reflect openly on those events. I think we obviously do need more initiatives of this kind, both to record the human stories and to depict the other in a humane and empathetic light, but also, of course, historical documentaries. But again, you know, I think one of the problems is that when conflict outcomes become embedded within particular narratives of power and particular legitimacy formula, for instance, of political elites, it can be challenging to work on them. So I think we probably still need some time to process those events, but certainly we need far more of these kinds of initiative, and hopefully there'll be a more enabling environment for them than the one that we have right now.
Thank you very much for your answers.
In the description below, we are leaving the links to the films mentioned and shown in this episode. Thank you for your interest in our project, and we hope that this series gave you some things to think about.